Hello again. In this section of session 1, we're going to be talking about the doctrine of signatures and the application of the doctrine of signatures to flower essences. Now, this is, again, has quite a strong historical tradition to it as a method of understanding plants. And there's almost this belief in some areas that it's quite a simplistic view, and it was often ridiculed as a form of understanding plants. And it's more recent that it has undergone an emerging interest. It kind of comes in waves. And it was certainly an important component of herbal medicine and was traditionally taught within herbal medicine, people's understanding of herbal medicine. And now it's more commonly seen in traditions like homeopathy. But flower essences really discuss in quite a great deal of detail the doctrine of signatures, so I wanted to give you a bit of a grounding in this idea. So the doctrine of signatures is thought to have originated with alchemical traditions and also Hermetic traditions. And alchemical traditions have their roots in pre-Christian Egyptian and Greek cultures, so there was quite a lot of shamanic roots in alchemy and in the ideas of alchemy, and there's certainly shamanic roots in a lot of herbal lore, folklore. And shamanic ideas even shaped Plato's philosophical views on health and philosophy in general. And the doctrine of signatures is really looking for the predominant characteristics of a plant. So their appearance, their colour, the shape, the growing habits of not necessarily always plants, but we're applying it to plants. And there was this idea that when you look at all of those different signatures, little keys, and you put them all together, this gives you a reflection of the inner, deeper, more finer properties of the plants. So it was less about the physical aspects of the plants, though it was certainly applied in that way, and more about the finer, or the essence of the plant. And when you look at alchemy in relation to plants, and also the Hermetic tradition, they both sought to truly understand the essence of the plant, and they saw that as being different to just the physical properties of the plant, that there was this kind of spirit associated with it, of the essence. And there was also this idea that the greater picture, the macrocosm, the universe, was reflected in the microcosm, in the individual. So it was applied to both people and situations, but also to plants. And that it was important to understand the interplay between the two to truly understand the microcosm that you were dealing with, the individual that you're dealing with. And that was important in healing, but it was also important in understanding the healing modalities themselves. So historically, some of the writers of doctrine of signatures were people like Paracelsus, which we spoke about. He was a devout Christian physician, alchemist, and magician. And he or she formulated the 3 principles of healing. So the doctrine of correspondence, which was this, it was an archetypal idea that looked at the relationship between the microcosm, so it could have been a mineral or a plant or an animal, like a person, in relation to the planets. So astrology was a component of alchemy, in relation to other components of the macrocosm. So trying to see relationships and laws that could be followed. Doctrine of signatures, which was basically this idea of as above, so below, so seeing the macrocosm in the microcosm, and the law of similars, which is populated in homeopathic traditions to this day, and you can read a lot about that in homeopathic philosophy. So Paracelsus saw the doctrine of signatures as a really practical application of the doctrine of correspondence, and it was this knowledge that the inner essence of an individual, the inner essence of healing, the inner essence of a treatment modality was based on outer characteristics, and that these outer characteristics represent configurations of energy patterns, archetypes in plants, and correspond to similar patterns in people. So the doctrine of signatures was not looking superficially for resemblance, but looking for something that operated on the level of essence. And we're going to explore this idea as we move through this course. We're going to start with kind of very physical aspects and looking at, oh, this may equal this may equal this. But as you dive more and more into the doctrine of signatures, you're looking for the overall expression of the plant. You're looking for something much bigger than kind of ticking a few boxes and saying this equals this. And it becomes almost in the same way that language can be very specific or it can be very poetic. The doctrine of signatures can be seen as a poetic expression. So it's almost like we're trying to deeply understand the essence of the plant, the essence of the flower. So we're going to play with that as we go through this course. So the doctrine of signatures was, from Paracelsus' point of view, this idea that God was putting a signature on each thing. God was attempting to explain through a very poetic language what each plant meant, and therefore what healing properties it may contain and how we can use them for healing purposes. And whilst we may not use the word God anymore, some people aren't necessarily comfortable with that term, whatever term you think of for a power higher than yourself or something bigger than yourself, just kind of insert that into this, and that idea is still very much alive today. Here's a couple of other important historical people to do with the doctrine of signatures. There are a couple of books that were written on this topic and how it applied to health. A lot of these people were predominantly alchemists and astrologers, and tied together their view on how the world kind of interacted from a much bigger point of view into health. So that's what we're seeing here. Jacob Boehme was one of the more famous writings in the 1600s, early 1600s. His ideas were, he was said to have a mystical vision in a dream, this idea that God was kind of showing what plants were for what. And these visions or dreams he wrote down and consolidated in a book, and then those ideas were pretty quickly applied to medical theory and treatment. And so that idea became quite well spread. So he was quite famous for that. Nicholas Culpeper, of course, wrote The Complete Herbal and does include some doctrine and signatures within there. So for those of you who have The Complete Herbal or want to check it out from the library, you can have a look there. Matthew Wood he also has some books in the library that he's written numerous books, I think it's about 7 of them, and he kind of sprinkles doctrine and signatures throughout his book as well. there's reference to at least one of those books in the reference list at the end of this session, so it's another more modern version of this. So when we look at doctrine signatures applied to flower essences, what we're really looking for are things like the habitat where the plant grows, the shape, the colour, and also growing habits. And we're going to go into detail about these as we move through, and even things like smell and stickiness and sensations, feelings of the plant. These are all taken into consideration. And what you find is, because this is more of a poetic language, what you find is some signatures, when you look at the whole plant, aren't as significant, and so they kind of get drowned out by the overwhelming majority of signatures, which may point to a very specific healing property. So it's important to remember that this just isn't a cut and paste kind of idea. This is not just, okay, well this definitely means this, and therefore, you know, this is what the plant's for. It's a much more poetic, and in some ways much more intuitive. So the first doctrine of signatures to look at is colour, and there are lots of ways to look at colour, and there is no perfect way to look at colour in doctrine of signatures. So the first is related to chakras. This obviously came out of the Indian yogic tradition from philosophy, and some people kind of relate very easily to that system and others don't. I'll give you a couple of examples of chakras as we move through. The psychological effects of colour and its symbolic meaning, and of course this is going to change culture to culture, but there are some kind of overarching correspondence that you see with all the different traditions. So we'll go into that a little bit as well as we go through. The correspondence between body colours, so body parts, body colours, and the plant. So black that heals bruises, for example, purple that heals purple things. Also think of your traditional medicine. So in traditional Chinese medicine, they associate colours like yellow with bile and liver, or red with blood, inflammation, heat. And there are quite a few traditional healing modalities that kind of ascribe a colour to a component within the body, an organ system, or a diseased state. So these are a couple of examples, symbolic or physiological, psychological meanings. And of course, you can look at examples like colour therapy. For this, there is some research into the use of different colours in healing environments that may set about different psychological traits. So blue being very calming and healing, green being soothing, all these sorts of ideas. So blue's the first one there. It's generally considered a cooling colour. So when you look at even at the energetic aspects of something like traditional Chinese medicine, they would ascribe cooling or warming to different colours, and certainly you see that even in interior design. So cooling, calm, clear, clean, distant, etc. And the example given there is of chicory. Chicory we will study when we do the bark flowers, and chicory is quite a calming flower essence. It's quite a cooling flower essence, so it can be used for when there's kind of explosions of frustration and rage, for example. The next one down is almost the flip opposite. It's red. Red is very vibrant. It's associated with heat and intensity. It can also be associated with aggression and passion, rage. And the example given there is scarlet monkey flower, which is the picture for screaming red anger, and it looks like a little mouth screaming out, doesn't it? Quite a strong doctrinal signatures there. So here's a rough attribute of colours to chakras. Now, it depends on the system actually as to the 6th and 7th chakra, what colours they represent. So this is kind of one idea, but these are generally considered appropriate. So each chakra basically moves up through the body. So you see the first chakra being instinctual, survival, grounding kind of aspects, red, and it's generally considered to be in the vicinity of the coccyx, kind of, because these are energetic terms, there's no physical kind of area, but it's basically at the base of the trunk of the body. The second is generally around the sexual organs, or the reproductive systems of humans in general. Generally, it's often given the colour orange, and it's all about creativity. The third is yellow, generally around the solar plexus area, associated with sense of self, and it keeps going in that way. If you're interested, there are lots of yogic philosophy books around chakras, so you can go and have a read there. But this is just one example of macrocuppa, which is an Australian bush flower essence, which we cover some of those essences as we go through. But macrocuppa is a great example of the red from a chakra, because red is generally attributed in chakras with the first chakra, the base chakra, and that's all about survival instincts, being part of the tribe, and the fight or flight. You know, it's very animalistic, if you want to think of it in those terms. Very earthy, very grounded. And macrocuppa is one of the signatures, is this deep red colour that's associated with that fight or flight instinct component. Macrocuppa is for adrenal exhaustion. So when that fight or flight resource is being overused. This is another example, the other end of the spectrum, white, which is generally considered the 7th or crown chakra, the top chakra. And this is an all-pervading sense of connection with something bigger than yourself. So this is the connection with divine, or with light, or with God, or with that peaceful meditative state, samsara, however you want to say it. And a great example of that is the white lily, and we will be studying lilies towards the end of this course. And that's a beautiful example of the colour of white being not just purity, but perhaps a more divine quality to it. Shape is really important as well. So here, this picture is really beautiful. We have a couple of different doctrinal signatures already forming. So pink is generally associated culturally with a gentle, kind of nurturing, loving, mothering kind of feeling, sensation. And when you combine this with a heart shape, you automatically start to think of the heart and think of the qualities of the heart, and unconditional love and nurturing, and those sorts of qualities. And so we're already starting to see different doctrinal signatures being put together. In shape, you're really looking at how is this flower kind of growing? Is it expanding or is it contracting? Is it ascending or is it descending? here's an example of actually a bark flower remedy, or Bach, however you want to say his name. And this is Star of Bethlehem, and it's a beautiful example of a shape that is kind of in an expanded state rather than a contracted state, and it's very simplistic and it's open and quite radiant, and everything about it is kind of out rather than kind of holding in. And so you get this sense of openness, you get this sense of uplifting, you get this sense of here I am. Energy that's moving from the center of that flower all the way out. There's a lot of activity in the middle, and then it has these big, kind of broad-reaching arms, if you like, that are moving out from the center, and it's moving out in an equal way. There's not kind of one petal that's massive at the top and the rest are small. It's all equal. And Star of Bethlehem is used for places of shock, so perhaps for when say a car accident has happened and the energy just kind of freezes. And this is about coming back to the center and then radiating out appropriately from there. So keeping that energy flowing. Orientation is really interesting. And again, is the flower growing upward or is it growing downward? Is it expanding? Is it contracting? Does it, like in the sunflower, does it have a very clear doctrine of signatures where it follows the sun? And what does that mean? And this is all taken in consideration with everything else. So here's a beautiful example of borage. So borage flowers grow downwards. They're kind of downcast, if you like, heavy-hearted. And the colour of blue, when it's in excess, can be associated with a state of depression. We talk about people being blue, being sad. And those beautiful petals that are radiating outwards, similar to the Star of Bethlehem, gives you this idea of what the healing potential is for that flower, which is moving out of the shackles of depression. If somebody is bound in depression for a long period of time, what does that do to the vitality of the individual? And what's the positive expression and the wisdom that can come from that place? Number of petals. Numerology is an interesting one. Again, it tends to be culturally specific. There are some commonalities though, and this is by Julia Graves, who wrote a great book on the Doctrine of Signatures, a relatively recent book that you should be able to find in your library. And it kind of consolidates a lot of these ideas. It's a great book if you're interested in the Doctrine of Signatures, from a very kind of practical and condensed book, which up until very recently was near impossible to find. So I've given you a list of a couple of them. She goes into more detail in the book, but it gives you an idea of, if I'm looking at something like the Star of Bethlehem versus something like the sunflower that we saw, even though they're fake petals, they're still petals, does the difference in the number of petals mean something? Does that look significant? When you look back at the whole picture, is that the thing that stands out the most? Is it very clear? And then does it have a corresponding meaning that makes sense within the context of the flower? Blooming is another interesting one. Blooming during the day versus blooming at night. If it blooms at a particular time, so there's some flowers, for instance, that will only bloom at 11 o'clock, and that is very specific to that flower. There are some flowers that only bloom at night, and they have a very specific scent because they're trying to attract a specific moth, for example. And when you look at, for instance, in traditional Chinese medicine, yin and yang, and you look at the time from midnight to noon as being a very masculine state, a very young state, a very open state, a very heat state, a very, everything's warming up, everything's outwards, everything's happening in the morning, generally for plants. And then there's this kind of quietening down from midday through to midnight, and it becomes a more introspective space, it becomes a more yin space, a more feminine space, and that may have a significant influence on the interpretation of the flower. So here's the example of one that blooms only at 11 o'clock, Star of Bethlehem, and it's quite well known for that. It's even got the common name 11 o'clock lady. Smells is another really interesting one. So sweet smells are generally considered a signature of the heart, and holly is a great example of that. That's a Bach flower batch, however you want to say his name, that is kind of, it literally drips with sweet, sickly sweet nectar. And holly is probably my favourite remedy for the heart. It's a beautiful remedy for a heart that is closed down out of fear and is reacting in a kind of anger, hatred kind of state. But it shows that true nature of the heart is one of openness and sweetness, dripping with sweetness. I love that idea. And also sage that relates to the elements. So when you look at aromatherapy, for example, they'll talk about scents being earthy or scents being kind of air-like or divine-like, scents being to alleviate different conditions, but also to bring about certain states, certain emotional states, to encourage certain emotional states. And this is all taken into consideration with the doctrine of signatures. Feel, so I talked about stickiness as a good example of this, and there are a couple that kind of call out when I think of flowers that are sticky, and one is chestnut bud in the Bach flowers, and this is all about kind of being stuck in a mindset and not learning from the same pattern, a repeated pattern. The other one is honeysuckle, also Bach, and that's all about being stuck in the past, and it's a very sticky flower. And you can see this in flower essences. A lot of the ones that are used for moments where people are stuck in the past often, they're very sticky flowers, and it's almost like they have these kind of talons that grab on. So it's an interesting doctrine of signatures. Next is growing habitats. So when we consider where plants grow, we can have a little indication about the vitality that's required in order to grow in those areas. So a plant growing in the desert, for example, that thrives on really quite oppressive, abusive-like conditions, may have quite a strong doctrine of signatures, and you see this in Australian bush flower essences, for example. They are, a lot of them are big, strong flowers, despite growing in quite difficult conditions, sandy soil with no nutrients and no rain for, months at a time, and harsh sun, and yet they're vibrant. And then you see rainforest plants that are continuously protected, or you see plants that grow in, and flower essences actually from plants that grow in glass houses. Now, they're very protected plants, and they sometimes can have a different feel to them when you take the essence. So it's interesting, and something that if you want to start to play with these ideas, that you might want to make up your own essences from desert plants versus plants that you have growing on your balcony, wherever. Growing habits as well are really interesting, and are taken strongly into consideration, particularly with plants that have unusual growing habits, like air plants, plants that aren't really attached to the earth. They may be quite etheric and quite not quite of this realm, so they may be used for moments of passing over, for example, moments of death and dying, not quite of this realm, quite of this earthy plane. Or something like vine. Think of a vine that grows over the top and sometimes suffocates and kills the plant that it's growing over. What kind of personality perhaps is similar in that way? And I just wanted to finish up with a bit of a discussion about what the flowers may be used for, and I'd love to see you post your ideas onto the blog. The first one that we've got there is bottle brush, and so I'm interested into what's the most noticeable thing for you when you look at that picture. What really stands out? Is it the colour red, and what does red mean? Is it the shape? Is it the multiple petals that you see there? Is it that it looks like a bottle brush that you clean a bottle out with? And how might that relate to health? Is there any orifices within the human body that maybe get stuck that might need a bit of a clean out? Start to think. Start with the information that we've given you here, and then maybe start to branch it out a little bit. Maybe start to let yourself get a bit more intuitive. Start to play around with that more poetic aspect of the doctrine of signatures and just see what happens. See what you come up with. The next flower is Southern Cross. So when you think of a cross, what are some of the cultural significances of a cross? What does it mean to you? How might that relate to an emotional state for a person? Look at the colour associated with the Southern Cross, and anything else that just kind of automatically jumps out at you. Even look at the leaves there. Are the leaves, you've got two different examples of very different leaves. Does that stand out as well in relation to the flower? Is it significant? There's no right or wrong answer here. I just would really love to hear your ideas around this. And this is something, like I said, that we're going to build upon as we go through. But I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of the more poetic and the more bigger picture aspects of the doctrine of signatures. And I really look forward to fleshing this out a bit as we go on through the course.